Next speaker of the day is architect Smaran Mallesh. His is fifth semester studio.
So I'm going to be talking about architectural design in the fifth semester. Principally, I'm okay with the objectives of the syllabus in terms of what's been prescribed for the fifth semester. It basically entails creating architecture as an envelope to system-dependent program, understanding the role of symbolic and thematic abstracts and imagery in influencing architecture, need for imagery as one of the important architectural goals, and design emphasis on the use of innovation in material and techniques of constructions. I've basically taught studio a few times over the past few years, and syllabus aside, one of the biggest challenges for me when I go into teach in any of the semesters, be it 5th, 6th or 7th, is a bunch of jaded students. One of the reasons why I chose 5th semester is also because it's a midway stage in the span of them being an architecture student, so it's somewhere in between. And it's surprising how by the time they reach the 5th semester, the students are already biased towards what they like, what they don't like, what they can do, what they cannot do, who's really good in class, who's not, who can really sketch well and what that implies, who can paint well and what that implies. So there are already these preconceptions of who a good architect is. And to top that, there is this jaded mentality that students have because of probably all the other subjects that they have to kind of give their time out for, or time constraints, or maybe they haven't had studio that was fun. So for me, the first step as a teacher or as a tutor that I would kind of embark on when I would get into studio is to really get them excited. How do you get a bunch of architectural students excited about design? How do you kind of provoke them to do something that they've never done before? So this is something that is really important for me. And the core of, so this really, and I was telling Bharat this when he first mentioned this to me, is what I'm going to be talking about is definitely not something that I would say is prescriptive. It's not something that I would say is something that a particular semester should be taught like, or should be a certain method of pedagogy, but it's a very personal opinion about how design should be discussed, or design should be, I hesitate to use the word taught, but design should be made a process with a bunch of other students, or how do you kind of collaborate to do something together. So it's a very personal opinion about how things have to be done. So what I really believe in is this idea of innovation, technique, and process. Why I'm really interested in this is because I feel predominantly studios or architectural design in studios should be a speculative process. And for this, I think it's really important to have an alternate starting point, and the reason why you need an alternate starting point is also to kind of break the monotony of what the students have gone through as a process or as a method, which has almost become like a habit. So I'm really interested in an alternative starting point, and then really pick on a technique or a process that is driven by issues. I think Bijoy also mentioned that, not by type, but pick on a process that is driven by issues and really lead into a direction that they've never taken before, and then kind of figure out what the end result of that is. So it needs to be extremely speculative at the core of the design intent of the studio. So evolution of the project through an iterative process is really important. I think there has to be equal importance given to make and think as opposed to think and make. I think trying to set up a process that leads to happy accidents is extremely important. And I think the idea of drawing, and I think all of us in our offices are always complaining about students coming into the office and not able to draw technically right. But what is equally important is to look at drawing as an emblematic graphic, a graphic that kind of entails architectural issues and overall effects of the project. So emphasis in drawing, to draw in such a way that it sort of embodies the feel of the project. That is extremely important. And the last thing is, I think more than a teacher slash tutor, I would like to sort of look at the role of a group leader, and rather than breaking the classic diagram of one being on the dais and the others on the other side, I would really want to be part of the entire class as a group leader and then embark on this process of finding something new. I think that is really important. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to look at 3 projects. These are student projects. These are projects that I was part of as a student. So I'm looking at 3 start points. The first one that you're seeing is this idea of a precedent. The second one is this idea of analogy, and the third one is to look at text or sort of a theoretical underpinning to start a project. The first project is basically to redesign Oscar Niemeyer's own house. The second one, so it's design of a house, the first one. The second one is looking at doing a temporary installation, and the third one is designing a skyscraper. So you have different scales, one is permanent, one is not. But what is important when you embark on this idea of an alternative starting point is that each of these entail in themselves possibilities of what architectural issues or possible design directions can be. So the idea of the precedent, and when you look at sort of studying an architect's work or studying a building that's already done, would really mean to eke out everything that every architectural issue that particular architect or that particular building was concerned about, and then you sort of distill that as your first principles as you move ahead. The idea of looking at an analogy would be to really look at would really force a student to empathize with whatever that is that they're studying. It could be to understand a sensory feel, a sensual feel. It has a tactile way of understanding things, and you empathize with it. And then when you look at text as a starting point, you obviously you go through this theoretical framework of a particular person's work, and then you understand the core issues of that, and then you look at how you could take it to the next level. So these are just 3 starting points. There could be many more. I've just picked 3. And as you go down these strands, you start looking at I think analysis is the key word, wherein you start interpreting each one of these. So if it is to do with the idea of the precedent, then you really get into a certain way of analyzing it. Could happen through drawings and plans, and you basically try to get to a diagram that is a critical diagram of the work that's already been done. How do you get to a graphic that really entails all the architectural issues that a particular build project had embodied? Or when you look at the idea of the analogy, how do you really look at diagramming in a certain way, or how do you reduce a certain feel or a certain aura or a certain spirit that an object has into a bunch of diagrams? I mean, what does it entail? How do you go through this process? Or when you look at distilling text into a set of objectives, is it possible to look at you read the text, you look at the larger network of available examples, and is it really possible to tabulate this so that you start looking at issues in an extremely tabulated and organized way so that you can pick from something? And then how is it that you take what you've distilled or analyzed, and how do you project that into the next level? How is it that you can pick out things or these issues that you had, how do you interpret these issues? I think interpretation is the key word. How do you kind of interpret what you've learned or what you've kind of gathered into possibilities that could go in many different ways? And I think the idea of iterations and the idea of actually looking at interpretation becoming many possibilities that one hasn't really imagined, possibilities that could be happy accidents, and these happy accidents could be new directions that one could take in the work, and setting up this system of actually creating a number of iterations and then trying to make judicious decisions about this in a very critical way, given the issue that you're interested in and the direction that you want the project to take becomes extremely important. And I think another thing that happens while you're trying to have an iterative process going is that you invariably develop a technique. Technique is basically the art of making. And then you start making things, and this really, and I think the art of making itself informs the way you think. And for example, if you're doing something with a particular material, it's the strength of the material or the sensibility of the material that starts informing your design. So how do you kind of open yourself up to all these other faculties? And I think what is equally important is to then slowly kind of rein back this entire process into a set of decisions or drawings or some kind of tangible objects that start becoming a building. Because I understand that at the end of the day we need to have grading, we need to have finished projects. But how do you then? And I think this is where. The studio guide comes into place, because if you've set up this process, then and there are going to be accidents that are desirable and those that are not, and it's really the studio guide, and that's why I think this is a very personal way of doing it, and you have to interpret with the students as to what is it that is salvageable or what is not, and what do you pick and what you don't, and how do you take that to the next level. And I think processes like these can always keep vacillating between the digital and the analog. I mean, it can be physical and it can be digital. So you could do things on the computer, and then you could again kind of do things by hand, and one can inform the other. And I think as you go on the process, I think things should start crystallizing themselves, and I think what is, and I think I mentioned this a little bit before, I think what's really important about drawings or models or any of these things is, more than them being technically right, I think they also have to have this quality of being emblematic in terms of every drawing or every model that's made should be an argument you're making about the feel or the architectural issue that you're chasing. And I think that becomes really important. And I think in conclusion to the process, it's really important to look at results in two ways, in terms of, I think every culmination of a project should happen in some sort of a graphic representation that embodies the entire process of the studio. I think there could be a project, and I'll talk about that, but the end product is as important as the entire process. So one really has to insist on how we get from point A to wherever. And I think the emphasis should be on really graphically representing this entire journey from one point to the other. Or conversely, I think there could also be an emphasis on the final product. And the reason why I've included these projects is because there's a lot of emphasis on the envelope in the syllabus, which I'm not tampering with. I think it's all right for the 5th semester level. Or it could even be objects of a certain scale that can really kind of that can really entail the real feel of a real building. You know, how do you make an object that kind of really gives you that kind of a feeling of the effects that you desire in the real building? Is it possible to make a sculpture, or not look at this as something that is scalable, but look at this as something that can really substitute for it at that point? Finally, I think I just want to end by mentioning just this little anecdote. Me and a bunch of friends usually we drive up this hill where this paragliding happens, and I'm usually the designated driver because I like driving, and I think the drive to that hill is really nice, and invariably I get to drive a different friend's car, so it's a nice experience. And recently I drove a 4x4, which was also a lot of fun. And while we go on that road up that hill, we eat at different points, which is also a lot of fun. And we usually get up there, and I never do anything because I'm scared of heights, but my friends, last time around really gave me a tough time for being a sissy, so I decided to take the leap of faith. So I put on the paragliding equipment and I jumped off that hill. And we usually go to that hill because the views are really nice. But this time, based on what they did, I jumped off that hill, and then the currents in the air took me up, and after the first 2 minutes, after I knew that I was alive, I really started enjoying the whole experience. And I went up there and I went swiveling up with the wind, and I had to negotiate that. And I saw things that I had never seen before. The views were absolutely fantastic. I saw things that I had never seen before. The experience was exhilarating. And at the end of 20 minutes, when I had to come back, I was really sad that it was over. I think teaching a studio should be more like the paragliding experience and not like the boring drive. So thank you.